Hello! This review of Donkey Kong 64 is part of a series of reviews of Rareware's 3D Collectathon platformers for the Nintendo 64. I'll be making references and comparisons to points I've made in my reviews of Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie, so I recommend watching them first. Donkey Kong 64 released in 1999, to a great deal of fanfare and anticipation. With Rareware having developed the immensely popular Donkey Kong Country series for the Super Nintendo and having more than proved their skill on the N64 with Banjo-Kazooie, expectations for the game were heightened to say the least. Nintendo had a great deal of faith in the game as well. They invested over $20 million in a massive advertising campaign and expected it to outsell Ocarina of Time.
This turbocharged game has better graphics, more moves, bigger bosses, huge worlds. It's so big we included an expansion pack to get it all in.
It didn't quite meet that lofty goal, but it did end up selling over 5 million copies worldwide and was met with high praise from critics and fans alike at the time of its release. Unlike Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64's reputation seems to be more of a mixed bag. Popular opinion of the game has become polarized over the years. I've seen it described both as a timeless masterpiece and overrated garbage. The mixed feelings surrounding DK64 are actually the reason I decided to re-examine these games in the first place. So let's take a deep dive into Donkey Kong 64 and see just what kind of legacy it's earned. The game opens in typical Rareware fashion, with an amusing cutscene to set the stage. The technical improvements in presentation over Banjo-Kazooie are immediately evident, with far more dynamic and cinematic camera angles, more sophisticated animations, and full voice acting. The sound mixing and voiceover can make it difficult to understand what's being said at times. But these aren't especially important details. The cutscene is charming and effective at imparting the main plot points. King K. Rool intends to destroy DK Isle with a giant laser and has kidnapped Donkey Kong's friends and stolen his hoard of golden bananas to distract him. The cutscene conveys all of this at an efficient pace, feeling shorter than its 5-minute length. Unfortunately, the end of the cutscene gives way to what is by far the worst opening tutorial section in Rare's lineup of N64 platformers. Upon leaving DK's house, the player is given a brief summary of the plot and is directed toward Cranky's lab. Cranky then points the player to a series of training barrels containing tutorial minigames. After completing these, Cranky teaches the player how to ground pound, allowing them to leave the starting area. When entering the DK Isle hub, Squawks points the player in the direction of K. Lumsey's island, who then opens the way to the first proper level after another cutscene. Comparing this directly to the opening of Banjo-Kazooie leaves a lot to be desired. First is the fact that this tutorial is mandatory. This immediately tacks on a few extra minutes of tedium to every replay. The structure of the tutorial also leaves it feeling less cohesive and less fulfilling. The player has to wade through multiple loading zones and tutorial text boxes completely devoid of personality, and the minigame format feels pointless when the time limit is so lengthy as to make failure practically impossible. There's also no immediate application for the moves being taught in the starting area, much less a reward for having mastered them, as was the case in Kazooie. It's even stranger then that this tutorial also feels somewhat incomplete. Basic attacks, and even some types of jumps, such as the backflip and long jump, are completely absent from the training barrels. I'm not suggesting that players won't be able to figure out these controls on their own. But if a game is going to forcibly tutorialize certain mechanics, I feel it makes more sense to prioritize those mechanics that are used most often. DK64 instead chooses to put basic movement by the wayside and focus on picking up and throwing barrels, a technique that's rarely used for most of the game. The sluggish tutorial is ultimately a minor complaint on its own, but it, alongside the rest of the opening, speaks to a consistent negative pattern, a combination of slow pacing and clunky conveyance. From the moment the player begins the game, a constant barrage of cutscenes, camera angles, and text boxes dictate exactly where they need to go next. This feels patronizing and constantly brings the gameplay to a halt. Worst of all, this kind of explicit direction is practically necessitated by the level design. The DK Isle hub world is expansive, and it's easy to see how a new player might spend a lot of time wandering aimlessly without these blunt directions. In that sense, it's easier to understand the conveyance choices that were made here, but I would propose that all of these problems with conveyance and pacing could be solved with 4 fairly simple changes. First, the contents of the training barrels could be moved directly into the starting area. Second, take the entire starting area and make it a part of Jungle Japes, the first main level. Third, prevent the player from entering the DK Isle overworld until they've defeated the first boss. And last, move the lock for the first boss key onto the entrance to K. Lumsey's island jail. With these relatively uncomplicated changes, we see the following possible improvements. The starting area feels more fleshed out and purposeful. Each of the training barrels already represents a small challenge involving the game's basic mechanics and could reward the player with a banana coin. Tutorial text could be made optional and assigned to nearby signposts or NPCs. After collecting all 4 coins, the player could then purchase the ground pound move from Cranky, allowing them to leave. A new player can explore this area at their leisure and perhaps collect a coin or 2 without even being explicitly prompted to do so. This makes the learning process faster, more organic, and more rewarding. In addition, having to purchase the ground pound move better reflects the rest of the game's upgrade system. After completing the tutorial, the player moves immediately into actual gameplay in Jungle Japes without stringing them along in the overworld. The placement of the tutorial area within Jungle Japes would also allow for the removal of this somewhat extraneous section reteaching the player how to climb trees and jump on vines. Lastly, the large golden lock almost directly in the player's line of sight after leaving Jungle Japes would make it clear where the next destination is. I also feel that giving the player the key first is more effective in a storytelling sense. Now, the player has already seen how much effort it takes to obtain the keys, and the possibility of making an ally out of K. Lumsey feels that much more significant as a result. It's telling just how much these 4 changes, which amount to little more than the shuffling of existing level geometry, might improve DK64's introduction. Of course, it's easy to make these kinds of high-level sweeping criticisms 20 years in the future, and these complaints don't amount to anything game-breaking. But DK64's first impression suffers heavily without the same level of care seen in the Banjo games, so consider this a small coat of polish rather than a teardown. And for what it's worth, there are some signs of those design sensibilities in Jungle Japes, the first main level. In a similar fashion to Mayahem Temple in Banjo-Tooie, the level is somewhat linear in structure at first, with all of its paths locked away except for the one leading to Diddy. This provides a natural introduction to Funky's armory, the weapon system, and the Battle Crown arenas, and forces the player to focus on freeing Diddy before all else. This is all accomplished quite effectively, and is one of the few points of praise I have for DK64's intro. However, this brings us to a much more significant topic. In freeing Diddy, Donkey Kong 64 introduces what is easily its most contentious mechanic, an enormous amount of color-coded, character-specific collectibles. Even among those who love the game, the one thread of critical thought that most seem to return to with Donkey Kong 64 is too many collectibles. When a game earns an entry in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest amount of collectible objects in a game, it's not hard to see why people might say that. However, I've always felt that this criticism was only surface level. This has always been less a matter of the number of collectibles and more to do with how they're used. In other 3D platformers of the era, basic collectibles serve a dual purpose. On a small scale, they provide immediate positive feedback when exploring a 3D environment. On a large scale, they're used as measures of overall completion, either as a high score counter or by unlocking barriers to the player's progress. These uses are present in DK64 to a degree, but the color coding undermines both of them. More often than not, players entering a new area will be using the wrong character. At that point, they either have to immediately backtrack to a tag barrel, or revisit the area later in order to fully complete it. Setting aside the obvious tedium of having to retread old ground, I feel that there's something uniquely frustrating about this situation. The player finds and reaches an object only to be forbidden to interact with it for reasons that are completely arbitrary, and this has a hugely negative impact on the game's feedback loop. Normally, basic collectibles reinforce a player's decision to experience the game world. One of these objects coming into view creates a positive sense of purpose. The collectible's presence wordlessly informs the player that they're in the right place, doing the right thing. Collecting it is rewarding for the same reason, and often provides an extrinsic reward in the form of overall progress. In DK64, these objects instead create a sense of obligation. More often than not, a collectible object coming into view simply adds another checkbox to a gradually growing to-do list. To their credit, it seems the developers may have also realized this. Unfortunately, their solution is to make a bulk of these collectibles optional. This has the unintended side effect of devaluing them. This is a problem because common items only act as a reward when they have a reasonably consistent value even as the player continues to collect them. If the perceived value of these collectibles disappears or even simply trends downward, the positive effect of their presence is diminished. As a couple of illustrative counterexamples, let's look at notes in Banjo-Kazooie and coins in Super Mario 64. Notes in Banjo-Kazooie are required to progress through the hub. Imagine for a moment that note doors only required a certain amount of notes from a specific level. If this were the case, the moment that the player reached that threshold, there wouldn't be any incentive to collect more notes aside from self-imposed completionism. Using a game-wide note total rather than a per-level requirement means that notes continue to have value even when the player has passed this threshold. In addition, once all of the main note doors have been opened, a handful of bonus note doors in the final area provide a further incentive for the player to seek out every note they can. Coins in Mario 64 bring you closer to an additional star. Players are never disincentivized to collect coins, since in addition to coins healing damage, the 100 coin star uniquely allows them to stay in the level after attaining it. This means that they can collect it without losing any progress they've made toward another star. In Donkey Kong 64, on the other hand, less than half of the regular bananas are needed to complete the game. Once this threshold is reached, their value, except for players aiming for 100% completion, is essentially zero. Even if a player is aiming for 100% completion, only 3/4 of the bananas are required to achieve this. Even worse are the banana coins. Less than 200 are needed to purchase every item and upgrade in the game, yet there are nearly 1,000 of them. Once the value of these basic collectibles has been exhausted, these large open worlds are now half filled with objects that add nothing to the player's experience. And even when there is value, the effort required to actually collect them is never proportional to the reward they provide. So yes, there are certainly too many collectibles in Donkey Kong 64, but the number wouldn't be an issue if they were used in a way that actually engages the player. The long-term value of those collectibles and the short-term positive feedback they would usually provide are both undercut by compromises that arguably had to be made for the sake of certain other mechanics. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Instead of delving down that rabbit hole, let's take a quick look at DK64's camera. For quite a while, I was under the impression that DK64 used a modified version of Banjo-Kazooie's camera system. As in Kazooie, the camera feels fairly loose and fluid in its control. It has the same small, interruptible camera swings, reactive positioning, ability to center the camera behind the player, and fixed camera segments. All of these aspects work to the game's favor in providing a useful view of a complex world. Interestingly, it seems that my initial assumption was incorrect. According to Chris Sutherland, lead programmer of the Banjo games, teams at Rare were generally quite insular, and little code was shared between them. This might account for two unfortunate differences between the camera systems in these games. First, the camera seems to have a greater tendency to get stuck on level geometry. This ends up making the second difference, a distinct lack of motion easing, more apparent. Coupled with the fact that most of the playable characters take up a larger portion of the screen compared to Banjo and Kazooie, this makes fast, jumpy camera movements far more frequent. The camera can occasionally become a serious hindrance when a small change in direction results in a huge disorienting camera movement. This is a particularly common occurrence in the game's numerous narrow hallways. And while we're on the subject of narrow hallways, let's talk level design. In the interest of time, I won't turn this into a level-by-level commentary. I'll instead touch on a few specific observations in a handful of levels. Some of these are positive, some are negative, but overall I think they speak to some deeper patterns, which I'll get into afterward. Frantic Factory represents possibly the best realization of DK64's central conceit, and certainly one of its strongest themes. Factory levels are far from a novel concept, even solely within the Donkey Kong series, but an evil toy factory is an interesting spin, and it's executed fairly well. The use of toys also breaks up the drab factory environment with occasional splashes of color, and introduces some unique and goofy set pieces. However, the tone is unmistakably foreboding, complemented by the unusually understated music, and one of my favorite songs from the game's soundtrack. The music box intro giving way to moody strings perfectly captures the strange combination of whimsy and somberness represented by the level's setting. That setting also provides the level a much stronger focus on platforming. Unfortunately, that focus brings to light the shaky platforming foundation the game is ostensibly built upon. This really comes to the fore in the production room, a tall cylindrical area filled with moving machinery. This environment seems perfectly suited for deft navigation through industrial hazards, but ascending the room tells another story. An unstable frame rate, jerky momentum on crooked, narrow platforms, and a camera whose positioning is not at all suited to the room's shape end up making it far more frustrating than rewarding to reach the top. I can only assume that the original intent was for the player to make this tedious climb repeatedly. There are 4 switches at the bottom, each revealing a different Kong's golden banana above, and there are multiple minor collectibles belonging to different characters on the way up. However, the placement of this warp pad 3/4 of the way to the top leads me to believe that this idea was scaled back. The warp pad's presence makes this timer for Chunky's golden banana completely superfluous, for example. So maybe it's not much of a surprise that no other level features platforming as prominently when this one showcases how lacking that kind of precision platforming can be. If Frantic Factory has one major advantage over most other levels in the game, it would be its very sparing use of the 5-door structure. DK64 seems to have an affinity for this construct, a building or area with 5 character-specific doors with unique challenges behind each. At the very least, this level's use of the 5 doors is limited to the R&D area, which looks and feels different enough to make the change in structure feel appropriate. A centrally located tag barrel reduces backtracking, and overall, this section avoids calling attention to its use of this trope. This much can't be said for the next level, Gloomy Galleon. I'm not going to mince words here. Gloomy Galleon has always been my least favorite level of all the Rareware Collectathon platformers. I didn't like it as a kid, and I've never enjoyed replaying it. When recording footage for this review, I strove to enjoy it for what it was, and failing that, at least understand what it does wrong. So here's what it does wrong. The ship graveyard concept is interesting from a thematic standpoint, but it's almost completely at odds with everything the game is trying to do. Put simply, swimming is boring. Very few 3D games have managed to make swimming even remotely interesting, and Donkey Kong 64 is not one of them. All of the Kongs move at the same sluggish speed through the water, and a complete lack of combat and puzzles leaves the experience feeling pretty barren. The single enjoyable piece of DK64's underwater gameplay is On Guard the Swordfish, a character with fast, fluid underwater movement in any direction who can leap huge distances into the air. Unfortunately, this ultimately just serves as a revealing contrast to the tedium of moving about the level in any other form, as On Guard is a temporary power-up and is unable to collect items. The player has these brief moments of quick, genuinely fun movement in the water, usually to destroy or open a barrier, and then has to painstakingly retrace their steps as a Kong to the exact same place. Gloomy Galleon isn't completely devoid of charm, but for every unique and interesting feature, it seems eager to pair it with finicky, frustrating minigames and superfluous cliches. For example, this button that changes the height of the water. It seems to exist solely because this mechanic is a staple of water levels. Tropes like this aren't a problem in and of themselves, but this use of it fails to feel purposeful or even follow any kind of internal logic. Changing the water level also inexplicably changes the water level in this cave, even though the cave is completely isolated from every other part of the level. All of these complaints are minor nitpicks in the face of the level's most striking flaw, which is its extensive and almost torturous use of the 5-door structure I mentioned earlier. In the center of the lagoon lies a sunken ship with 5 gates. Each is opened with a different Kong's instrument. Each Kong then has a different section of the sunken ship to explore and a golden banana to collect. I'm honestly struggling a bit writing this because there's no way to adequately describe just how boring and uninspired this particular set piece is. The player opens a gate, enters the ship, swims around, collects a few objects, then leaves. Then they do it 4 more times. 6 if you count this separate ship off to the side that operates the same way. I'd like to pause for a second to clarify something. I've always found particular distaste in the reductive description of a game as nothing more than its core elements in an attempt to criticize it. You can make any game sound boring when you do this. For example, in Super Mario Bros., you move to the right, jump over obstacles, and eventually reach the end of the level. This kind of rhetorical device intentionally ignores the artful combination of so many aspects of game design. The variety of level geometry, the challenging placement and patterns of enemies, an engrossing sense of atmosphere, the joy of discovering a well-hidden secret, the satisfaction of solving an interesting puzzle. I avoid using this kind of reduction whenever I can for this reason, but it's simply not possible to avoid it here. There is nothing to this. The sunken ship lacks every single one of these aspects. The layout of each section is different, but when it comes to swimming in 3D space, there's no difference at all between swimming down a vertical shaft and swimming down a hallway, so it all feels the same. There are 1 or 2 enemies, but they're trivially easy to avoid. There are no secrets or puzzles. The ship does have a somber and spooky atmosphere with a handful of visual Easter eggs, but this is stretched far past its breaking point by the sheer tedium and repetition of this section. The only mechanical attempts to liven up what is essentially an extended swimming section on repeat are timers on the gates, which are pointless as there's nothing to navigate between the player and the ship entrances, and 3 of the golden bananas being locked behind bonus games. The bonus games in question are a slot machine, which is used at 2 other points in the game, a reflex test used 3 times elsewhere, and another swimming section, with a fixed camera perspective that makes some of the coins practically invisible. It's difficult to give the game credit for these bonus games when the only one that has any thematic consistency with the level it's in manages to be worse than the one that's a slot machine. The 5-door ship alone makes Gloomy Galleon a strong contender for the worst level in the game. Other levels make use of the 5-door mechanic, some of them multiple times, but none of them are nearly as tedious in their execution, both inside and outside the structure itself. So the underwater sections are less than stellar and make up more than half the level. This might be more excusable if the remainder of the level wasn't also mostly bland and uninspired. Galleon represents the halfway point of the game, and by now, narrow branching hallways feel less like a part of the game's level design vocabulary and more like a crutch that it constantly leans upon. The occasional enemy or basic collectible does little to mask the feeling of padding they create when traversing them for the nth time. I understand the technical need to partition large levels in this way, but no technical reason can explain the awful use of signifiers and barriers in Galleon's use of this trope. To explain what I mean, here's a quick counterexample. This corridor in Frantic Factory leads to a bonus area accessible only by Tiny Kong. We see a purple banana in front of the door, signaling to the player that they should switch to Tiny before exploring it. But then in Galleon, the player comes to this 4-way path near the beginning of the level. Once again, purple bananas lead them down this corridor, only to be met with a gate that only Diddy Kong can open. Purple bananas also lead the player down the opposite path, to a gate that only Donkey Kong can open. These gates block off huge sections of the level, and once they're opened, they stay open permanently. It's impossible for players to reach this point in the game without Diddy or Donkey Kong, and a tag barrel is located at the center of this intersection, so adding a gate requiring them is completely pointless busywork. Unlike the barriers in, for example, Grunty Industries, these have no real thematic or functional place in the level at all. So not only are inappropriate signifiers used here, the reward for picking the correct Kong is the removal of obstacles that shouldn't be there in the first place. Believe it or not, an even worse example exists in Fungi Forest. Here, we come across another pair of superfluous gates that the player opens permanently. The first is a gate that only Tiny can open, followed by a string of purple bananas that lead Tiny into the corridor, where the player finds a gate that only Chunky Kong can open, and a single extra purple banana after the gate. The simple act of walking through a hallway and collecting the objects inside it requires changing playable characters up to 3 times and doing nothing unique or interesting with any of them. At a certain point, it gets a bit difficult to give the developers the benefit of the doubt when, for lack of a better term, it really just feels like they're trying to mess with you. But while we're on the subject, the main issue with Fungi Forest isn't malicious or uninspired design, it's missed potential. The concept, like so many in DK64, is compelling, with a day-night cycle changing how the level works. It's just disappointing that so little is actually done with this mechanic, and what is done feels kind of phoned in. Wrought iron gates with an icon to indicate the required time of day spontaneously appear and disappear, some enemy types are different, and certain events and minigames simply can't be activated during the wrong time of day with no explanation. I don't feel that the missed potential is too hard to see here. The gates in particular feel like placeholder assets that were never properly iterated upon. Off the top of my head, I can think of a much more thematically fitting way to accomplish what the gates attempt to do without too much extra effort: flowers and mushrooms. Specifically, flowers that bloom during the day and mushrooms that sprout or grow larger at night. These could each be used as platforms, barriers, and visual signifiers indicating the required time of day to access an area all in one. It would be nice to see this used for more than simply unlocking virtual doors as well. Maybe rain could only occur in the garden area during the day, or some areas could be much more difficult to navigate in the darkness of night, meaning the player has to make a logical connection between these features and the time of day. As it stands, Fungi Forest is far from DK64's worst level. It has a good theme both conceptually and visually, and a handful of genuinely thoughtful puzzles that suit the environment. It's just disappointing to see the execution of its central mechanic fall so short of its high potential. On the other hand, the last regular level in the game, Creepy Castle, feels like it has hardly any compromises, at least from an overall design standpoint. In some ways, it feels like a breath of fresh air compared to the conventions that the game had been leaning on so heavily up to this point. The main area is very open, with the usual narrow connecting hallways replaced with a path that spirals up the outside of the castle, with logically placed warp pads serving as checkpoints along the way. The castle's various rooms and catacombs have character-specific areas, usually denoted by switches. In a manner of speaking, the castle as a whole serves as a variation on the 5-door structure, but its use feels more natural here. Instead of a single set piece with 5 evenly spaced doors on its front, leading to identical feeling interiors, each area and entrance feels distinct enough to be purposeful. The verticality of the main area also makes it possible to reduce backtracking by warping or flying to the top and descending rather than repeatedly climbing. The haunted castle aesthetic proves to be incredibly versatile, realized through cobwebbed ballrooms, museums, libraries, foreboding dungeons and crypts, graveyards, overgrown trees, greenhouses. As a final level, and as a level in its own right, Creepy Castle has the strongest theme of any level in the game by far. This isn't to say that it's flawless. It has its own share of bonus game repetition and tedious backtracking, but it's hard to fault it too much when it feels like the only level where the balance of these factors is in its favor rather than against it. So what can we glean from this brief-ish overview of the game's levels? Clearly, DK64 is at its strongest when it comes to theming. From an aesthetic standpoint, the richly detailed, varied environments and the honestly impressive scale of each world are standout points of praise. Even the weakest levels find some reprieve here, which sees the most insignificant areas peppered with visual flair and detailed texture work. The game's strong use of color is also notable, giving each level a distinct mood and feel, from the warmth and coarseness of Angry Aztec to the cooler tranquility of Crystal Caves. DK64 also has a claim to fame as one of the few N64 titles with dynamic lighting. Though not quite as advanced and intricate as Banjo-Tooie's, it's still always impressive to see this kind of detail on such limited hardware. The game makes use of a clever optimization technique for light sources with consistent paths, such as a swinging lantern. This lighting is recorded during the first visible pass, and then played back as an animation afterward. We can easily observe the benefits of this technique as we witness the frame rate slow down when entering an area with these dynamic lights, and then observe the frame rate smooth out after the first pass of each light source. While DK64 is known to have its fair share of bugs and optimization problems, the kinds of touches like this lighting system show that those issues certainly don't come about from a lack of insight or effort when creating such a massive, complex game. As you might expect by this point, the strength of the game's presentation extends to its score and sound design as well. Once again, Grant Kirkhope demonstrates a commendable amount of effort not only in crafting memorable and appropriate melodies, but taking the vast scale of the game into account through extensive use of musical variations. The main area of each level establishes a central melodic figure. The later sections of these themes often develop or iterate on these melodies, but they serve more prominently as the basis for the downright staggering number of variations each level theme receives. Aside from reinforcing a contextual change in environment, they also help to break up any potential monotony from hearing the same song on repeat. From this perspective, I considered Mad Monster Mansion a standout in Banjo-Kazooie's soundtrack with its 6 variations. I would be remiss, then, not to once again mention Creepy Castle. Its main melody is already a perfect fit for the level with its clever reincorporation of the Donkey Kong Arcade intro jingle. But then, we get a truly ridiculous 13 variations on this theme. And these aren't simple MIDI instrument swaps either. Changes in time signature, completely new sections, and no shortage of spooky ambience all work to create a surprisingly diverse series of compositions unified by that same central melody, and all in a single level. This isn't to say that the entire soundtrack is full of winners. Gloomy Galleon again comes up a bit short, though I would guess this is mostly because the music is another victim of the questionable choice of level theme. When a level is mostly a big lake filled with rotting debris, it's hard to score it as anything but a somber, slow-paced funeral dirge. Overall, though, it's evident how much care and effort was put into DK64's soundtrack. What results is a fondly remembered score that's difficult to criticize too harshly. If one thing is clear at this point, it's that Donkey Kong 64's worlds excel in terms of audiovisual presentation. Where the game more consistently falls short is in the functional use of all this pretty-looking level geometry. Compelling and interesting uses of these expansive worlds are the exception rather than the norm. Traversal and exploration are always means rather than an end unto themselves. What I mean by this is that you never find yourself wandering through the level, leaping across platforms, making informed observations about the environment, and acting upon those observations to discover something or uncover a reward. Instead, the player finds themselves almost strung along by the game, led by the hand to blatant cues and calls to action. Responding to these calls to action almost always does one of two things: an instantaneous reward, or the opening of a gateway to isolated challenges. Sometimes these are completely divorced from the larger world the player is trying to engage with. The bonus games are by far the strongest example of this, and are especially grating when the player accomplishes something or solves a puzzle, only to have a bonus barrel appear. The accompanying fanfare practically begs the player to regard this disconnected extra step to the reward they seek as something desirable. And it may well be for some players, but this comes at the cost of eliciting an eye roll and an exasperated sigh from the rest, and that's never the kind of response you want to evoke when you're trying to reward the player. In fairness, that kind of response would be far less likely if the bonus games themselves didn't leave so much to be desired. This type of diversion is a mainstay of the Donkey Kong series, but one key facet seems to have been lost in the translation to 3D. In the past, these bonus games represented a variety of small twists on the core gameplay. In DK64, the mechanics of the bonus games are often so far removed from the rest of the game that they don't feel like they even belong in the same genre. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing if the variety that's being introduced is interesting or fun or engaging. Unfortunately, that's largely not the case here. Of all the bonus games on offer, we have a maze, a combat maze, a stealth maze, a platforming challenge, a swimming challenge, an action puzzle using minecarts, a slot machine, a shooting gallery, 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 and a shooting gallery. This categorization may seem a bit unfairly narrow, but when the mechanic of the minigame boils down to quickly point your weapon at the target and fire, it's hard not to qualify them as being effectively the same. In fairness, some of the shooting gallery bonus games do differ on more than an aesthetic level, though it certainly doesn't help that the only shooting games that don't lock your reticle into rigid whack-a-mole slots suffer from fairly spotty hit detection. This, coupled with a constantly buzzing fly who laughs at you as your fly swatter clips directly through it, doesn't do much to endear the player to these kinds of minigames. On that subject, there is one bonus game I've neglected to mention. I've done so partially because it defies classification, and partly because I feel it deserves special attention, even though it already has an infamy of its own.
Welcome to bonus stage.
Beaver Bother is the unholy spawn of Satan, having taken the form of interactive computer software. This might seem a bit zealous, but it's the best explanation I can give for the existence of this Sisyphean nightmare of a bonus game. It's certainly the most in line with classic Donkey Kong bonus games, but at the risk of making myself a hypocrite, I would rather play the slot machine for every single golden banana in the game than be subjected to a single round of this misery. This became clear to me somewhere around the 40-minute mark of my continuous attempts to complete the game at the top of Creepy Castle. Speaking from an excess of personal experience, there's only so much fruitless circling around a featureless wooden barrel one can take before their mind starts to unravel. The phrase herding cats comes to mind not only as an artful comparison, but a desirable alternative, because even the risk of having my eyes scratched out is favorable to the insipid chittering of these stupid beavers as they sit stubbornly on the edge of the hole, refusing any further input, stuck on some imperceptible geometric anomaly that exists solely to spite you and the free time you chose to spend on this unyielding task. And all the while, a joyous, frenetic tune underscores this slow slip into madness, picking up in tempo and intensity as the clock winds down and you pointlessly try to convince yourself that, hey, maybe it's possible to get 5 more points in 15 seconds. The analytical side of you knows that it can't be done, but the game is so non-deterministic that in your heart of hearts you believe that it might just happen. And that fiery belief forges the hammer that crushes your heart of hearts into dust as you pause and restart again and again as the music loops from the start, an endless parade of clowns on brass and xylophone as you dance for their amusement. Around and around, over and over, and you come to the realization that you don't actually hate the Beavers, you envy them. You envy their oblivious, aimless existence, free to wander and run and stop and start however they please, regardless of your input. But more than anything else, you envy their ability to fall, to enter that abyss that's been hovering at the focal point of your vision for what feels like eons, an unknown oblivion that becomes more and more tempting with each revolution of your useless player character. Just as the Beavers prefer that fate to the jaws of the beast, you find yourself drawn to it because anything, even something below the bottom of the barrel where this minigame belongs, has to be preferable to the limbo you find yourself in now. And in one last cruelty, falling down brings you right back to where you were, one more ceaseless cycle in the shapeless amalgam that your life has become. And you know now, beyond all doubt, that when you close your eyes for the final time and you reach that bright light at the end of the tunnel, it will be accompanied by an unmistakable voice telling you all you need to know, all you will ever need to know. Welcome to Bonus Stage! It's a cute and creative idea, but it could have used some more playtesting and iteration to smooth out the experience. What's currently there feels frustratingly unpolished and inconsistent. On the other hand, the combat maze and the minecart puzzle stand out as high points in the selection of bonus games on offer. The former because it's actually a proper reflection of the core gameplay. Existing mechanics are focused into a timed challenge with an excellent backing track. The latter because it's a challenging puzzle that behaves consistently and constantly engages the player. It's a brand new mechanic where the only frustration comes from the player's failure. If the rest of the bonus games could more closely follow the example set by these two, rather than the cavalcade of shooting games, the constant barrage of bonus barrels would be a clear point of praise, rather than something more accurately described as padding. This is made even more evident when examining the level-specific minigames and bonus areas. Even though most of these consist of minecart rides and various kinds of races, all of them are leagues ahead of the bonus barrels simply by virtue of being something different while still clearly looking like they belong to a particular level. The minecart sections are especially good examples of how even a linear, on-rail twitch reflexes section can be made exciting with the right visual flair and presentation. Again, this is something the game consistently excels at. Unfortunately, while that strong presentation can help enhance entire levels, it can't help the fact that moment-to-moment traversal in the levels themselves is just plain monotonous. The vast majority of the terrain in levels consists of flat ground or gentle slopes in largely unbroken swaths of land. Almost every horizontal gap that can be cleared without special abilities can be cleared by a single regular jump. Larger gaps usually make use of floating vines, and only a few gaps in the entire game actually require multiple jumps across platforms or any kind of mid-air maneuvering. What we get as a result is a ton of uninteresting movement along the ground, rarely broken up by more than a single jump, ledge grab, or climbing the occasional pole or ladder. This issue is made worse by the momentum that the player wields as each of the playable characters. Despite their vastly different statures, all of the Kongs have nearly identical acceleration, movement speeds, jump heights, and jump arcs. Two of them, Tiny and DK, have attacks that can also be used to briefly increase their movement speed along the ground. A technique that yields a small forward burst in momentum is common in 3D platformers, but DK64's implementation of this technique has some unfortunate drawbacks. Comparing these moves to their counterparts in Banjo-Kazooie and Mario 64, jumping with the Talon Trot and long jumping respectively, provides the best illustration of my point here. DK's roll and Tiny's slide kick each take about 50% longer than these moves to execute. While DK's roll does provide a substantial increase in movement speed, it can't be used to clear gaps or ascend in the way that long jumps and Talon Trot jumps can. This, in addition to the longer animation and the fact that it can only be used when playing as DK, makes it much more difficult to use in combination with other movement techniques. The comparison with Banjo-Kazooie feels particularly apt here. As I noted in my review of that game, the basic act of movement is a fundamental part of its everlasting success. Its engaging nature is accomplished through the use of multiple movement modes, appropriate movement acceleration, varied terrain with different properties, well-realized aesthetics, and condensed level design to ensure that point A and point B are never too far apart, or even out of sight of one another. Consider the impact that all of these factors have on how you experience a level moment to moment in Banjo-Kazooie. The player will not only find themselves changing direction, adjusting the camera, switching between movement modes, attacking enemies, interacting with level features, and of course jumping from platform to platform, but will find themselves switching rapidly between all of these contexts almost constantly. Control over the character becomes a seamless chain of varied movements and commands in service of a goal that the player can usually already see. There aren't many areas in Banjo-Kazooie where the player finds themselves holding the control stick in a single direction and repeatedly using an acceleration move for more than a few seconds at a time. The same can't really be said for DK64. To clarify, I'm not trying to insinuate that there's some magical threshold of movement speed or animation length that makes a game fun. Rather, I'm trying to illustrate why DK64's movement might feel sluggish or cumbersome specifically in comparison to its contemporaries. A lack of dynamic movement options and no real opportunity to creatively combine the options that are there contributes heavily to this feeling.